other interesting document that we looked at from 1905 were the personal property tax records showing continued use of the property for agricultural purposes. But the interesting thing is that the Hinkins family were charged with a pianoforte, and which tells us a lot of things, along with the sewing machine. They happen to be two things listed in the personal property holdings. It indicates that Mrs. Hinkins obviously sewed and made a great many of her daughter's clothes, as well as the fact that they had a piano. And the earlier census records from 1880 don't show that their daughters were at school, which is what the sort of notation was on many census records, so that they were probably instructed at home, either by their mother or by a tutor. So there are sort of little things that you can find out from official records that you might not be able to determine any other way. Mr. and Mrs. Hinkins had 4 daughters and 1 son. Their son did not live to adulthood. He died in the 1890s. They both died. Unfortunately, they died intestate, which means that they did not leave a will, and the property was left to their 4 daughters. There are several land transactions, which, as I say, we can go into when you read the history. But the first time that the name Harmony Hall actually appears in a public document is 1938. We looked and looked and looked. It was called John Kern's Place or the Hinkins Farm, but it was never called anything else other like Harmony Hall, at least officially, until 1938. In 1938, the property was acquired by the Rhodes family. In 1968, it was acquired by Beatrice Heath O'Connell, whom I'm sure you all know of. In 1969, it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. In 1970, the main house was documented by the Historic American Building Survey, which is a measure of the importance of the building in and of itself, in cooperation with the Virginia Historic Landmarks Commission and the University of Virginia School of Architecture. In 1990, Beatrice Heath O'Connell generously donated the entire property, which by then included 96 acres, to Bell Grove, Incorporated, with life tenancy to her son, Irvin O'Connell, Jr. In 2002, the 3,500-acre Cedar Creek and Bell Grove National Historic Park was created that included the Fort Bowman property. And in 2006, Mr. O'Connell donated the rest of his life tenancy to Bell Grove. And in December, the Bell Grove Foundation donated a preservation easement on the house to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and a conservation easement on the property to the Virginia Outdoors Foundation, thereby protecting both the house and the surrounding acreage. That's sort of a quick and dirty run through the timeline. There are one other sort of item, and I don't want to take too much time doing this, but there were a couple of things that jumped out at me in the course of doing a lot of this work. One is the remarkably important presence of women in all of the transactions on this property. When you look at how the title goes, the property was left to Isaac Bowman's daughter, not to one of his, I think he had at least 6 or 7 sons. In the division of the Kearns property, it was because Sarah Kearns, his oldest daughter, married George Amos Hinkins, that the property ultimately passed to the Hinkins family. It was the 4 Hinkins daughters who inherited the property. And then finally, Beatrice Heath O'Connell, who obviously was sort of the moving force behind being sure that this property was preserved in perpetuity. The other interesting thing, and I think this is one that we are getting far enough away from it now to begin to get some historical perspective on, is that during the 1930s, there was a real effort to promote the history of Virginia and the history of its various regions. It was also a time when agriculture was in serious decline, just as it was across the country. And at that time, Annie R. Wharton, who was married Hinkins, her maiden name was Hinkins, she and her son mightily tried to promote Fort Bowman as an historic site to be visited, and produced a very interesting brochure that we found to be an invaluable source of information on the property. It was at that same time that the state launched its historical highway marker program, and Fort Bowman, because of its association with the Bowman family, was deemed worthy of having one of those historical highway markers erected in its to mark in. So I think that there are just a couple of the little themes that you have to think about when you're looking at stories like this or properties like this, and it's those stories, of course, that make it fun. So I'll let Maral talk about the buildings and show you the pictures, which are more fun to look at.